you would open your Bibles to Matthew chapter 5. Every once in a while I check the videos just to make sure that everything's working right. Not that Sarah's not doing her job, just Facebook sometimes doesn't work right. And I notice I am a very fidgety person. I'm really hard to watch, so I apologize for you all that you have to put up with me each week. I only catch a couple seconds because I can't stand to hear myself talk. So both hearing and seeing is a terrible thing, so I apologize for a few seconds before you guys have to put up with. We have been looking at the Beatitudes for the last few weeks. We mentioned before that this is Jesus' first statements that we have directly to his followers about doctrine, how they're to behave, what they're to do. And verses 2 through 11 2 through 12 deal directly with the attitudes that we should be having. And then we're going to pick up there in verse 13 and read down to verse 16. We start talking about how we are to act specifically around other individuals. So there in verse 13 it says, "You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? Except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. You are the light of the world. The city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven." I think these verses are ones that we probably know, if not pretty well, maybe the very best out of chapter 5. These are ones that are probably, for the most part, committed to at least a rough memory in whatever translation is your preferred translation. And I don't think I have anything really brand new. I mean, these are verses we talk about quite a lot, but since we've been working our way through Matthew chapter 5, this is a really good thing to look at. Jesus here mentions the idea of how we are to behave around other individuals, what kind of light we should be shining, what kind of salt we should be having. He then expounds further upon that in chapter 6. And so we're going to kind of piece 2 or 3 main passages together. But he deals here directly with this idea. If you look down in verse 16, "In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who's in heaven." On Fridays, as often as we can, hopefully, we've been going through the book of Matthew. It was at Chick-fil-A until Chick-fil-A remodeled, and now we're over at the coffee shop, hopefully back to Chick-fil-A soon. But we had gone through Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7, within a couple weeks, because we're doing about a chapter a week. And we've since progressed on into chapter 12, and yet my mind has been stuck back in chapters 5, 6, and 7, because the Sermon on the Mount is something that is still challenging. I think it's challenging for pretty much anybody, is my assumption, that if you really dig into what Jesus is saying, it's something that is going to be challenging. He changes not only subjects, but he asks you to do things to a more firm degree than maybe we're comfortable with. To commit in ways that are going to force us to have faith. To act in ways that are going to force us to be selfless. To self-reflect in ways that makes us really uncomfortable. And so that's why my mind has been here over the last few weeks, but even though we moved on, my mind is still wrestling with the same things I have to deal with. And here in these verses, he deals with the idea of us doing good deeds. And there in verse 16, that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father. So the idea of both salt in verse 13 and light in verse 14 is an image for the good works that we're to do. And he makes the point here that this is going to be something that's for others. And so, if you will, keep your finger there in chapter 5. Turn with me to chapter 22. Matthew 22. When we think about doing good deeds, the way that we do them and the purpose behind them is highly important. And here in Matthew chapter 22, the question comes up in verse 34 and verse 35. What is the greatest command in verse 36? The Pharisee tries to trap him. What is the greatest command? And Jesus has an answer for them in verse 37, that you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and the great commandment, and the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And on these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. The point that he's making here is that this is supposed to be our motivation. For the good works he mentioned back in chapter 6, why do we do them? Is it just to do good works? Is it just to have a list of all the things that we've done? Jesus makes the point that if our motivation isn't because we love God, and if it isn't because we love our neighbor, then we missed all the law and the prophets. That if we try to keep all the other individual commands but miss this main point, the other commands don't really make sense. They don't really have. Chapter 13, which is, we all know, is the chapter where he deals with the definition of selfless love. Verses 1 through 3, he deals with the idea that what if you try to keep all of the following statements without love? So he says in verse 1, if I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers, and if I understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and have all faith, as to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. And if I give all that I have, and if I deliver my body up to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing. He makes those very absolute statements in chapter 13, that he is nothing in verse 1 except for a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal, that he says in verse 2 that he is nothing without love, in verse 3 that he gains nothing without love. Here are all these good deeds, and who could say that speaking in tongues wouldn't be a good deed back then? Or having all knowledge, or all wisdom, or all faith as to remove mountains, but still have not love? Or to give everything. If you were the most generous person that you ever knew, but your generosity didn't stem from love, that you gained nothing. And he means nothing. Sometimes we hear, well, you don't gain a whole lot, but he says nothing. And as we look back in Matthew chapter 5, and the idea of being salt or being light, that motivation behind it has to be there. That our doing our good deeds is for the benefit of others and for the praise and the service of God is key. And if notice the wording that he gives there in verse 13 and verse 14. It's not just go out and do good deeds. What he says is salt of the earth and light of the world. Those are two kind of key important things. For those who like to cook, seasoning the right thing with the right thing, rather important. Curry ice cream, I'm not sure if I'm on board with that. Salt to caramel, definitely on board. The right seasoning is important. The idea of our good deeds, our good works, is so that it benefits somebody else, that it should season the people around us. It should season the world around us. That it's, as he talks about later on, as Paul mentions later on, that our speech should be gracious, seasoned with salt, as fits the occasion. That we don't just go out and just do random things, but the idea of, if I know what you need, and I meet that need, I believe that is a seasoning act. If I'm supposed to build up and encourage, if I'm supposed to sometimes rebuke, if I'm supposed to help those who are weak, all those things are meeting a need that is there, and therefore fits the occasion, and therefore I believe salts. In the same way here in verse 14, that we are to be lights of the world. And our action should be illuminating in some way. That they should shed light on both what God's will is and what God's purpose is and the needs that people have in their life for God. That we are called to shine as lights in the darkness around us. As you get over to John chapter 15, John chapter 16, Jesus deals with the fact that if you are light to the world, that the world is not going to enjoy being exposed by that light. And that there's going to be some backlash for that. And so sometimes what we do is, well, I don't want to shine my light directly. I I don't want to I don't want to be so brilliant that I have to expose other people's sins, or I don't have to expose their problems. And yet, that's exactly the point that he makes here in verse 14, that we are the light of the world. How many people do you know who have a theoretical knowledge that the Bible is God's Word, and have practically no experience opening its pages? And that is just kind of the way that things are for the most part. But you know what? People get to see. And we can't make them go home and read the Bible all the time, as much as we would like to. And if you do get them to read, doesn't mean that they always just, okay, that's exactly what I need to do. I understand that, even though that'd be great. What I can do is I can be a light around them. They can see my good works. They can understand what that means. That's what Paul makes the point over in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, is that he always carries around in his body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may be manifested in his flesh. The idea being that if nobody ever sees God's Word, or somebody doesn't see God's Word, but they get to see you, they should get to understand what it means to be a Christian. That example should be something that's clear and in focus by the actions and the attitudes that you have around them. And that's the point that he makes here in verse 14, that you are light of the world, that you are salt of the earth, that it should season and fit the occasion, and that it should be something that is illuminating. And he also mentions there, as you look there in verse 15 and 16, especially verse 16. In this way they should see your light shine before others, so they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who's in heaven. All that we should do should be to the praise and the glory of God. The debate comes up over in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 regarding eating meat or not eating meat. And Paul makes this point there in verse 31. The point is not that it's whether or not you eat meat or don't eat meat, or if you eat a particular kind of meat or not a particular kind of meat. The conclusion that he makes there in verse 31 is this: so whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. Jesus packs so much into these couple verses in Matthew chapter 5. That the actions should not only be fitting for the occasion and for the building up or for the helping the edification of somebody else, not they shine as lights in the world, but they should be for God's praise and His glory. That's really a key. It's not just for us to go out and to do good deeds and us to have a reputation as someone who has good deeds, but to use that for the benefit, to the praise and the glory of God. That's really, really important. And if we notice here in verse 14, those good deeds are going to be noticeable. And I know most of you are already thinking Matthew chapter 6, but we can't be too noticeable. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But keep your finger there in Matthew chapter 5 and turn with me to 1 Timothy chapter 5. 1 Timothy chapter 5. Paul expounds on this idea when he writes to Timothy. And he expresses it in such a way that I think it makes it really clear. Notice how he phrases this in verse 24. 1 Timothy 5, there in verse 24, he says, the sins of some people are conspicuous, going before them to judgment, but the sins of others appear later. So also, good works are conspicuous, even those that cannot remain, cannot remain hidden. His point is this, is that Jesus has made the point several times throughout Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that we are to see people by the deeds that they do, that we are to judge them by the fruit that they produce. Paul hits on a really key point. He says some people, their deeds, their actions, their sins are conspicuous. You see that right away. Some of them you don't see until much later. How many people do we know who that has been the case? Where they've hidden things away for so long and so well that it takes everyone by surprise when it comes out later. His point is, it still comes out. And then the converse of that is in verse 25 is also true. Some deeds are ones that are hidden. that you're not going to see right away. But they still come out. And that good deeds are still going to be conspicuous. In fact, Jesus makes that statement extremely clear in verse 14. A city that is set on the hill cannot be hidden in verse 14. He also makes a point in verse 15 that if people do not light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to the whole house. Our good deeds are going to be seen if we're doing them. Which makes us kind of jump over to Matthew chapter 6 for a moment. We're going to read verses 1 through 8, because Jesus is going to give a bit more correction, a bit more understanding to his previous statements back in chapter 5. So he tells them, when it comes to doing good works in verse 16 of chapter 5, he says this in verse 1 of chapter 6, beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them. For then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. Thus, when you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may be praised by others. And truly I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. And when you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and in the street corners, that they may be seen by others. And truly I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you pray, go into your room and shut the door, and pray to your Father who is in secret. And your Father who is in secret will reward you. And when you pray, do not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do, for they think that they will be heard for the many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows that you need what you need before you ask him. Here he makes the point in verse 1, beware. There's really kind of a handful of these phrases that come up from time to time. And they're really important to pick out. Because if it's in the Bible, it's going to be important. That's just the way that it is. If you only have this much information given up to us directly from God, then every single word of it is going to be really critical. But if the author goes out of his way to say beware or be on guard or take note or do not be deceived, that means that there's a real chance that you're going to be deceived, that you're going to be caught off guard, that there's something that's going to happen that maybe you're not even going to realize, that you're going to be deceived, as we talked about this morning in Obadiah. So he says, beware of practicing your righteousness before others in order to be seen by them. That everything that follows is something that's going to be a challenge for everyone who's going to be trying to do good deeds. Because we kind of have moved here from the idea of back in chapter 5 of not doing sin. Verses 21, 27, 31, 33, 36, 43 from chapter 4, or chapter 5 rather, are all the sins that we're no longer to commit. He's dealt with that fairly thoroughly in chapter 5. So in chapter 6, he then gets into the good deeds that we're going to be doing. The ones that are salt, the ones that are light. And there's going to be a challenge for every one of us from time to time who are going to be trying to practice righteousness. That there might be ulterior motives. And that we really need to be on guard of our own hearts. And so that's what he begins with. Beware of practicing your righteousness in order to be seen by others. And notice what he says there at the end of verse 1. This is the same phrase that Paul used back in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. That if you do that, then you will have no reward from your Father who's in heaven. Not little, not some, but no reward. That even though those are good deeds that are being done, and that you are practicing righteousness for the wrong reasons, it counts as nothing. And he says that again in verse 2 when it comes to giving to the needy, that they have already received their reward when they're praised by others. And the same thing in verse 5 for the individuals who pray. In order to be seen by others, they have already received their reward. And it's really critical that we also have the right attitude behind it. So he makes the point here in these verses that it's not so much the idea of being covert, but the idea of not being showy. He doesn't tell them not to pray and not to give, but he tells them to do it in a way that is not showy. Now, how do you do that? That's going to be the big question. And Jesus gives us a couple ideas, a couple guidelines to go by. So he tells us here that whenever you give, make sure that you don't have any fanfare. And I don't think that what he's saying here in verse 2 is that the only way that you can do wrong is by actually bringing a trumpet with you. I think that's a kind of a general idea, that there's all kinds of metaphorical trumpets that we could bring. So what is it that do you see that people normally do in order to show off what they're doing? Don't do that. Whatever that is, that's the thing that you don't do. In fact, that's exactly the point here, is he uses the example from their day and time. You know that the hypocrites, they grab trumpets, and they have this fanfare in the streets to make sure that everybody knows that they're going to go give to the needy. That's what you don't do. In fact, you try to do the opposite here, as he says in verse 3, to make sure that you don't go out of your way to let your right hand know what your left hand's doing. And the idea isn't that you just have to be so sneaky about it to make sure that nobody ever knows. Just the idea of make sure that it's not showy. It's not flashy. And the same thing when it comes to praying. What if your main prayers, or maybe your only prayers, are ones that are in public? Maybe they only happen on Sundays, or they only happen on Wednesdays. What if that's the main time that you pray? Then there's a problem. And that's what it tells you, then go to your room. Make sure that and it's just that you have a room that is the place that you always pray. And if you're homeless, well then you're just all out of luck because you don't have any room to pray in. His point is, find some place that isn't going to be flashy. That isn't going to be there for the purpose of being seen. So I think what he's giving us here is an idea that you need to have some type of a personal checklist. What is it that you do to make sure that you're following this idea of not practicing your righteousness to be seen by others? And that's going to be changing from person to person. That's not going to be a hard and fast list. For them, it may be no trumpets, and it may be making sure that their prayers are not primarily in the synagogues, and definitely maybe not on the street corners. But what is the temptation that you have when it comes to these things? How is it that you let this word be, let the word be spread of all the good things that you're doing? And maybe for us, maybe social media is one of the big ones. How many times do people post of all the great things that they're doing on social media? Obviously, that would be our metaphorical trumpet. That could very well be our street corner in our synagogue. But you need to take some time and self-reflect and ask yourself, when and how often do you come back and check your motives? Because motives have a really sneaky way of shifting whenever we're not paying attention. And what I mean by that is that we start off hopefully really zealous for God. That we are just on fire, that once we know the truth, and once we have come to the realization how much we need God, we are gung-ho for attending services and going to meetings, and maybe even if door knocking or whatever it is, that this is what we're going to do. And then Sundays and Wednesdays become habit. Our actions are still the same, but the motivation has sometimes shifted. Maybe it's, well, we know that there's an expectation from everybody else that if I'm not here, I'm going to get phone calls, and I'll have to answer questions, and it's going to get really awkward and uncomfortable. Mom's going to call me, Dad's going to call me, Grandma's going to get on to me about me not attending services. There are all kinds of things that our motives shift. And that's why he says to beware. Why are we doing good deeds? How often and when do you check your motives, realizing that motives actually do change, sometimes without us even knowing it? So I have a couple questions as we look at these two main passages in Matthew 5 and Matthew 6. First main one. Have you been performing good works? Are they there? Because everything else doesn't really matter after we ask that question. The answer is no. And maybe put it as a time frame. And time frames are kind of arbitrary. Last 30 days. Can you say that you have had a stash of good works? As Kenny prays all the time, that's us having life and having it more abundantly. And that comes from, I believe, 1 Timothy chapter 6, that we are to lay up treasures here on earth, in heaven, where our true life is. The same passage he gets, the same idea that he gets here in Matthew chapter 6. There in verse 19, not to lay up treasures for yourself on earth where moth and rust destroy, but where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. So the idea being that there is work to be done, there's treasures to be laid up. Have we been doing that in the last month? Are others seeing that? And again, this always feels really comfortable because we know what he says in Matthew chapter 6, and not to be seen by others. But back in Matthew chapter 5, there in verse 14, a city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. And what Paul says over in 1 Timothy chapter 5 is that good deeds are going to come out. And what I mean by that is if we think we are doing good deeds, people are going to see them. And sometimes we trick ourselves into thinking that we're being good examples, or we think that we're doing good works, and nobody sees them, not because we've been really good at being sneaky about them, but maybe we haven't been doing them as much as we ought to. In that same vein, as we look back in Matthew chapter 5, there in verse 16 rather, when others see our good works, do they give glory to God for them? Or is the direction and the attention towards us as individuals? It's one of the great things we get to see over in John chapter 3, with John the Baptist baptizing and Jesus and his disciples on the other side of the river baptizing. And John's disciples come over all jealous, and they're baptizing more than us now. And John makes the point that I must decrease, that he must increase. Paul makes that point over in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, that it's neither Paul nor Apollos, it's God who gives the increase. And whenever it comes to our works, we should always take that, whatever attention gets put on us, and always give that to the glory and the praise of God. Always make sure that that's where it gets directed. Another question is, why? Why are you doing good deeds? Is it for the purpose of seasoning and enlightening others? Is it for the purpose of your service and your love for God? Or is it to be seen? Now, if we do good deeds, we will be seen for them. But we cannot do them to be seen. And sometimes it's really hard to look at verse 1 and go, yeah, that is me. I need to change. But sometimes that's exactly what we need to do. Have some of our good deeds simply become habit, rather than out of a motivation and a love for others and for God. And our last question is the good deeds that you're doing. Are they lighting others around you? Do they get to really see what it means to be a Christian by the good deeds that you are doing? Have you brought into focus what it means to be someone who is pure in heart, someone who is humble, someone who is seeking righteousness, someone who is mourning? Are those the things that they get to see? Are you seasoning others around you by meeting the needs that they have? Something that fits the occasion is something that is good and right and building up for them. All of that is built into these couple simple, short, easily memorizable verses. The idea to be salt and light, to do it for the purpose of others and for the glory of God. The song has been picked out as number 835. Thanks, I don't think that any of this is really revolutionary. It's just one of those annual checkups, so to speak. To come back and just ask us where we're doing, how we're doing on these things. But Jesus makes the point that if those good deeds have been done for the purpose of being seen by others, then there is no reward. Benefits nothing, counts nothing. And the idea of working as hard as sometimes we do for no benefit, for no reward, no paycheck at the end of the week, it'd be hard, wouldn't it? And yet so many times people have a passion and a love for God, but has allowed their lives just to veer so far off course that there is no reward. Paul mentions that in the book of Romans, that he testifies for his fellow Jews, that they have a real zeal for God without knowledge, meaning that they have this passion, but they've been somehow misaligned, that they've been shifted off course, that they haven't followed the truth. And I think sometimes that happens to us a lot, where we have a real passion for God, we have that zeal in our hearts, but sometimes we get off on the wrong path, and it takes us a long time to realize that we're not doing really as we ought to. And that's the case, and there is no reward for all of our passion and all of our zeal. We aren't doing what's right. And if we can help you to do that this morning, let us know as we stand and sing number 835.